Hello everyone and welcome to the Music Professor channel. I'm Matthew King. I'm here with my faithful assistant Loki. He has a new bed. I don't know if he likes it, but he's on it. Just to say, if you like the channel and you appreciate the content, then like and subscribe and perhaps consider becoming a patron via the details are below. Something called Patreon, or you can choose to just donate to the channel. All contributions are massively appreciated, so thank you. Today's discussion is going to be about Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata third movement, and I'm picking up on previous videos released, well, several months ago now, about the first movement and the second movement. So we're really continuing a kind of Beethoven soap opera here and hopefully finishing it off today. So we've talked in previous videos about the famous and wonderful atmospheric, mysterious first movement, and its connections with Mozart, and of course it is in a way a proto-romantic piece. We talked about the second movement, which is this wonderful, rather subversive minuet. And then Beethoven hits us with this incredible third movement, which is the biggest of the three. And it initiates a thing in Beethoven's work where the weight of the sonata or symphony or whatever the big piece is that he's dealing with shifts to the finale. In terms of the power, the force and the structure, this is the big movement of the sonata. And you get this a lot in his later music. Something else to think about with Beethoven, of all great composers, he is perhaps the master of the finale, because I can't think of a single Beethoven finale where there's something disappointing. I can if I think of Brahms. I can even with Mozart, where he starts, for example, the great G minor quintet. I always think the finale is a little bit disappointing after the weight of the previous movements. But with Beethoven, his finales always deliver. They deliver whatever it is that you require in order to sense, a total completion and satisfaction at the end of the symphonic work. And the Moonlight is really fabulous from this point of view. It's a sonata movement. This finale is a movement that delivers absolute ferocity on a level that no one had ever delivered before. I mean, I can't think of any finale to match this in terms of sheer sort of untrammeled, volcanic combustibility. I mean, it's absolutely intensely crazy. And if you play it, as I have had the privilege of doing very recently, I had access to a fortepiano for about 40 minutes and I just had to go without any prior preparation, and you'll hear the results later. And I can't pretend that they're perfect. They're absolutely nowhere near perfect. They're not even very considered. It's a completely spontaneous performance, but in a curious way, for me, it suits the volcanic character of the movement. Let me tell you, though, a little bit about the piece first. And to do that, I'm going to have to wrestle with the idea of sonata form. And some of you may be aware of sonata form, and then those of you who don't, I'll try to explain as I go. So sonata form is a sort of template, a model for writing sort of bigger, more important pieces in the late 18th century. And it's a form that's generally adopted for sonata first movements, sometimes finales, and also for symphonic first movements and for concertos. So if you're writing a big serious piece at the 18th century, you use this form for your first movement and often your finale, sometimes also for the slow movement. And even occasionally, if you're writing a minuet or a scherzo, that is in itself a sort of miniature sonata form. We won't go into that, but it's a form that's absolutely prevalent at the time. And Beethoven, of course, is famous for his absolute mastery of the structure. And here he is using it. Now, I've said that this is a movement of unparalleled ferocity at the time. I mean, it's ferocious. Consider the opening with its famous, it's sort of, I don't know, it's like a galloping horse ride with these terrifying sforzandi at the top. So it's got absolutely unprecedented romantic power about it. And here, he's writing this in 1800 or 1801. It really is ushering in the spirit of the new age. I don't think this is music that could have been written before the French Revolution. Somehow, it has a new revolutionary zeal about it. But as so often with Beethoven and with other great innovators, the innovatory aspect of it is counterbalanced by a kind of cautious aspect, almost a conservative aspect. It's very clear that Beethoven had Mozart in mind when he wrote this piece, and there are very Mozartian characteristics which I'll talk about as we go. And also, it's a piece that uses various improvisatory devices. Beethoven was a very brilliant improviser. And the opening uses something called the Passus Duriusculus, a descending chromatic line from tonic to dominant, from 1 to 5. So if you have a bass line and you're an improviser of the period, you might do this sort of thing. And it's been around since the Baroque era. Beethoven used it, for example, in a completely different piece, his wonderful variations in C minor. There's your bass note, and it's dropping chromatically. And you go to the German sixth, and then you go to the dominant. So it's exactly the same basic shape as the Moonlight. Takes the same pattern. Mozart did it too. His wonderful F minor fantasy from 1791, just a decade earlier, does this. And here's the approach to the dominance. There's a very similar pattern. And in the 18th century, if you were a really good musician, you would just naturally improvise on that pattern, that descent from tonic to dominant. It's interesting because the descending chromatic bass is a kind of lament. We've mentioned this before on the channel. Think of Purcell's Dido's Lament, for example. It does the same drop chromatically from tonic to dominant. Interestingly, Beethoven uses it a little bit later in his career when he's writing the major key sonata. The Waldstein Sonata also has a chromatic descent. So exactly the same sort of formula is being used, but in a major key. Although the style of the music is more buoyant, less tragic than this, it gives it a sort of an undercurrent of seriousness, which is very characteristic of Beethoven. Okay, so back to the Moonlight. So we have this wonderful opening, and I've described that harmonic progression, but the way that he, as it were, improvises over it is really wild, because you've got these sort of toccata-like configurations. The whole thing is marked presto, and then you have these forceful accents. The next progression is dominant, with a Schwartz sound at the end. Now we start to modulate towards F sharp minor. There's the German sixth, and then we hit the dominant. And then Beethoven uses one of these sort of quasi-Baroque passages, almost like something out of Bach or Handel. Looks like Loki's left the building, but he will return, I hope, later. So I was just talking about the Toccata-like neo-Baroque passage. A few weeks ago, I did a discussion about the first movement of Beethoven's Ninth, and he uses a very similar passage there. That bit. It's almost like Beethoven would use these slightly old-fashioned fillers. The Baroque style evokes an impression of something serious, and especially to a listener in the late 18th century, it's a little bit old-fashioned, but it has a kind of sternness and a learnedness, which I think Beethoven's quite keen on. So he sits on the dominant with this very expressive, but at the same time almost harmonically static passage. Comes to a sort of rhetorical pause, and this time you think, okay, so we're going back in again, which we do. But this time he shifts even higher to the high E octaves, and very quickly he starts to modulate. And we hit what's known as the second subject. So everything we've had so far is the first subject group and the tonic. Now we're going into the dominant. Often classical composers will go to the relative major in a minor movement to offset the minor key with something more sort of lyrical and genial in the major key. Beethoven doesn't do that in this instance. He goes to the dominant minor. He kind of doubles down on the minor thing. It's super serious. So we modulate to dominant, and here's our first tune. Now, I said earlier on that there's an influence from Mozart, and the primary influence here is that Mozart would think nothing of having 4 or 5 or 6 themes in his second subject. He just loved throwing different tunes at you. And Beethoven follows his example. So theme number 1 in the second subject group is contrasting with the sort of ferocity of the first subject. So it's this lovely tune. It even has that lovely expressive turn in it. I should say the whole movement is marked presto agitato, so that unusual even for Beethoven. It's super fast, but he's still able to give you this lovely, expansive, lyrical second subject. It keeps coming back to its dominant, D sharp, and D sharp, climbs up, D sharp again, and then basically a little variation, like an improvisation. Typical of Beethoven, he moves from a beautiful melody to a variation that sort of is the opposite. It's rhythmic, it's funky, it's energized. Can you see it's the same thing? So you've got this lovely tune, and then you've got it again, but kind of made funky. Right, now this is, if you like, theme number 2. So he's given us a tune and its funky variation with these wonderful syncopations. It's really compelling and thrilling, and I can't think of anything quite like it in the 18th century. It has a new kind of rhythmic power, and this is what Beethoven gives us, wonderful new rhythmic power. And just to prove it, here's the second idea, and it's got this wonderful, I would call it a kind of cross-rhythmic thing. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, where the trilling thing da, 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 is really like the third beat of a 3, if that makes sense. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So fantastic, kind of irregular rhythmic pattern. Also, the second thing to say about it is it's a bunch of perfect cadence, isn't it? Perfect cadence in C sharp minor, perfect cadence in B, we're dropping chromatically, another perfect cadence in A, and a fourth perfect cadence back to G sharp minor again. So we haven't really gone anywhere, we've returned to G sharp minor. Here's our third idea in the second subject group, and it starts with the Neapolitan A. Now, I'll have to explain what a Neapolitan is. We had it in the first movement. If you're in C sharp minor, the Neapolitan is the chord, first inversion of the chord that's a semitone above the tonic. So if you're in C sharp minor, it's D major. I'll give you an illustration for the first movement. Here's the beginning, speeded up. It's there's the Neapolitan, and it gives this wonderful mystery. I haven't got time to go into it in more detail. I'll make another video explaining Neapolitan chords because they're so fascinating. But here it is. So we're in G sharp minor, and then it's the opposite of the first one. It's a really bang down Neapolitan A major, just to go, here's the Neapolitan to kind of jolt you out of your seats. He does this lovely, almost Mozartian, delicate thing, bangs down the Neapolitan again, this time off the beat, and coming round to the cadence. And here's our fifth idea, I think it is. Is it the fifth? We've had this as our first, with this as its variation. We've had this one, so that's 2. We've had the Neapolitan, which is 3. Okay, this is really the fourth idea in the second subject, which is, I don't know, it's like a sort of string quartet, really. The outer parts are moving in contrary motion, and it really moves from chord 1 to chord 5. But that's not what's interesting about it. What's interesting is the movement of the parts and the way that he creates rhythmic energy all the time by bouncing it off the first beat. There. There. And then he does it again, but this time it's more antiphonal, it's more like a call and response, with the response being loud and the call being piano. And then we wind down, very beat, there's the Neapolitan again, and then into the final, the fifth idea of the second subject, which is just a beautiful, expressive, perfect cadence with these ornaments, these ornamental resolutions, and then back into the galloping horse. Now that's where the repeat comes. So in the traditional sonata form, you then have what's known as an exposition repeat. You have the first and the second subjects repeated, and it enables the composer to just play it to you again, so you grasp all the principal ideas. But we won't do that. We're going to go on. In my recording, I have to say I was too exhausted to do that, so I went straight into the development. So development goes, it's in the major, and off it goes, modulating, F sharp minor, cadence is in F sharp minor, second subject, main theme in F sharp minor, and then we get in the left hand, as if it's played by cellos. Instantly, because it's the left hand, it becomes more expressive, more romantic. And then just by shifting, Beethoven loves this kind of thing, just by chromatically shifting up a note with D major, and we go to G. The melody goes an octave lower in G major. That's had a wonderful turn there. Now that is like a Neapolitan again. G major becomes the Neapolitan, F sharp minor. Let me do that again. G major slides towards F sharp minor here, and the Beethoven now takes the bass, but with these emphatic sforzandi. C sharp minor, home key, and he lands on a dominant pedal. Traditionally in sonata form, classical sonata form, you'd normally reach the dominant pedal and sit on it to sort of generate sufficient tension to resolve into the recap. So it has this lovely long, it's like an improvisation, and sort of is one, with these lovely sort of descending pattern of first inversion chords. And then he does a little variation with a very different character. These beautiful swelling shapes to the dominant seventh. This time, the Neapolitan, two semi-breves as if we're in an adagio. Wonderful. And then back into the recap. Right, now this is exactly the same until we reach the big rhetorical G sharp, the big rhetorical dominant, and instead of writing the transition, he doesn't have to do that anymore. It just goes straight into the second subject, and it just runs its way through. Unusually for Beethoven, actually, the second subject group appears basically as it did originally, but in the tonic, in C sharp minor. Normally, he actually plays around with the material more, but here he, perhaps because it's so wild and tumultuous and there's so many themes and it's so good, he simply reproduces it in the tonic. And when we get to the end, this is where the invention really kicks off in this marvelous coda, because we return to the first theme as we wind towards a sort of cadenza-like flourish. And this is where you see Beethoven bringing back, appropriating back into the sonata some of the gestures you'd expect in a piano concerto. This is concerto style writing. He does it twice. The second time with the pedal down, and then what he does is he introduces, do you remember in the development section we had the tune in the second subject tune in the left hand? He does that. He kind of knows this is the heart of the piece, the emotional core of it. Here it is in C sharp minor. And then the right hand takes it up. And then a massive sort of cadenza-like sequence of arpeggios, F sharp minor, just a single semitone shift to turn that to D major, diminished, and then C sharp minor, it's kind of wonderfully huge C sharp minor, chromatic scale up to this beautifully mysterious A, and then, oh, what a piece of workmanship that is. It's like a piece of embroidery. Do you know, Chopin admired it so much that when he wrote his Fantasy Impromptu, this thing, which is a sort of tribute to Beethoven, he has this, that figuration is Beethoven's. Beethoven's invented that. He's basically just borrowed that beautiful piece of writing from the end of the Moonlight and into this sort of coda of the coda, which is really just, it just gives us the final idea from the exposition, this beautiful cadential theme. And we get 4 bars of emphatic arpeggios. Basically, this is the opening, but in both hands. And then the 2 final chords. So absolutely magnificent, masterful writing. And it sounds ridiculous to say this. It is music that sounds as if it could never have been otherwise. It's as if it just arrived in a perfect state. But of course, Beethoven wrote it. He had Mozart as a model. He had the template of sonata form. He wanted to write this tempestuous piece. He was a great improviser. So you kind of combine all those different things and you end up with this fabulous piece of music, cornerstone of the piano literature, one of the most famous pieces in the world. Thank you for listening. So just to remind you, at the end here, we have an annotated video of me recording this on a fortepiano. I had access to it for about 40 minutes a week or 2 ago, and I just made use of it without much prior practice, I have to tell you. So there's a lot of mistakes and a lot of imperfections, but some of the spontaneity, I guess, of the music is here, and you can hear it on a fortepiano. You don't often hear this music played on the instrument for which Beethoven intended it, and there's something wilder about the sound of a fortepiano. And the bottom note of the fortepiano is that F sharp, which Beethoven makes dramatic use of. He uses the full range of the fortepiano. It's almost like a different instrument, so see what you think, and please comment on whether you enjoy the sound of the fortepiano. And please be kind about the interpretation. It is, as I say, a spontaneous and to some extent unprepared performance, but enjoy.